Hello, and welcome to an overview of LSMW. LSMW, as you probably know, stands for Legacy System Migration Workbench, as you can see here. Now, there isn't a menu path to LSMW, so to launch the transaction, you can key it in up here, LSMW, or as I've done, you can add it to your favorites menu. You do that by right-clicking on favorites, going to Insert Transaction, and inserting LSMW, just typing it in. So we'll launch the transaction from here. What you see here is a project that I was working on previously. There are three fields, project. So to create a project, you type in the name, whatever name you want here, and then you click on create entry. That creates the project. You're then prompted to create a sub-project. Again, you key in whatever value you want. And then when you save that, you're prompted to create an object, which is the lowest level. And then you key in whatever name you want for your object and save it. And that's the shell of a project, sub-project, and object created for you. So let's take a look at this project that I was working on. So we'll just continue. Okay, now you see all the various steps involved in configuring LSMW. You can see here that specify files is selected. The reason for that is that that's the last step that I actually saved. I guess I changed something and saved it, so it remembers the last position you were at. But this project has, this particular object, I should say, within the project has been fully created. So we'll go to step one, which is maintain object attributes. So I'll double click on that. Okay, now you're into the display object attributes screen. Here we see the object that we saw earlier, object number one, and the owner, which is my username in this test system, and the type of transfer, it's a once only. You can see here there's a periodic button that can be selected. So it is possible to use LSMW for periodic loading of data into SAP. However, most people would get some ABAP development done if they're going to be using a particular function on a regular basis. So in my experience, LSMW is used normally for once-off data loading. Now, here we have standard batch or direct input. This is what's normally used. There are other options as well. Batch input recording. This is where there isn't a standard object to do the job you want. So you record the transaction in the normal way, whatever the transaction happens to be. You can then go back and use that recording as the basis for loading data into the database. There's also a business object method, BAPI, and IDOC, intermediate document method. But generally speaking, we use standard batch or direct. I prefer batch because batch has more checks involved. Direct is faster, but it doesn't have all the checks. Batch input is as if you were entering the data manually through the front end, so it has all the checks and balances there. Direct is faster, but nowadays with the computing power available, there is no reason really to use direct input. So here we select the object. As I mentioned earlier, I've been working on fixed assets in this particular project. So the object for that is 0160, but there is a whole list of objects available. Here we can see the list of available objects. GL, account master records, material master, bill of materials, vendor, customer master, purchasing information record, etc., right the way down to the one that I've selected, which is 0160. There you go, fixed asset. So depending on what area you're working on, you select the object that you need to do the particular job. You then select the method, and as I mentioned earlier, you've got a choice between batch input and direct input. I would recommend that you select batch input. That automatically selects the program name and the type. Okay, so that's the display object attributes. The next step is maintain source structures. Here we see a structure that I've created for asset accounting. As you can see, there are two levels here. The first level, the top level, which is for the master data, I've called str_baltd and the description baltd structure. The next level down is for the transactional data. Now let's take a minute to talk about this. This structure here relates to the data that we're going to load into SAP. And usually it's a good idea to mirror the structure within SAP that's going to be loaded. So how do we know what the structure is for this particular object? Well, let's go back a step. Okay, now if we go up here to Object Overview, click on that. Okay, you have a choice of how to display this, either in a list or a table form. I prefer the table. Now, here are the structures that SAP uses to accept asset accounting data. You may remember I called my structure str_baltd. That's because baltd is the top level structure for asset accounting. Now, when you create the object initially, you'll have the first four columns here. Right? The rest here relates to steps I've already taken. So let's just concentrate on the first four columns. In this structure, the first column is the field name, and then we have the description, we have the data type, and we have the field length. And they're the important bits that we need to remember when we're constructing our file for input. You may ask, why are we talking about structures and not tables? Because as we know, databases consist of tables which resemble spreadsheets. Spreadsheets have rows and columns, and databases have records and fields. Well, the reason for that is that in SAP, a structure is fields that can be taken from a combination of tables. So it's not the same as a table. And the data is not actually stored in structures. It's still stored in tables within the database. But a structure is similar to what's referred to as a view in, say, a SQL Server database management system, or Oracle, or MySQL database system. So we need to mirror this structure so that we format our data in the same way, with the same fields, with the same data types, and the same field lengths. And that's not to say that we need to populate every field in the structure. There are some that are mandatory, and there are some that are optional. So here we have a large number of fields within the BALTD structure. If we scroll down, quite a way down, we come across the second substructure. As you can see, the asset accounting has a large number of fields, mostly to do with depreciation areas. Okay, so this is the structure used to hold the transactional data. When I say hold the data, I mean to upload the data. The data is actually held in tables that the structure refers to. Okay, another way to look at the structure is if we go to the data dictionary. So let's go back to easy access. Now here I have saved another transaction, SE11, which is the ABAP dictionary. So if we load that up. Okay, now it says table here, but you can put in a structure as well. So BALTD. Okay, if we display that. Okay, we get much the same information as we saw earlier within LSMW. So you have the fields, you have the data type here, you have the field length, which are the important bits. This here, the description is important purely for information purposes, but the data type is very important, as is the length, because if you get the type wrong in your input file or the length wrong, you get errors and the data will not load up. Let's take another look at how we can see the difference between a structure and a table.
Go back to easy access here, and we run transaction SE16N, which is general table display. Okay, I had typed in BALTD before, so if we run that, okay, we get an error which says it calls a table, but it says BALTD is not the correct category. In other words, it's not a table. However, if we take a look at one of the tables that this structure references, for instance, ANLH, press return. Okay, so this is a table, and we've returned company code, ACID, and main text. Go back here. Now I could have restricted that to a company code because I've taken all company codes in this query, but that's the difference. So you can see that a structure is not viewed in this transaction because there is no table underneath it. So for asset accounting, we have two structures, and they reference a total of 9 tables. So you can see this is a neat way of grouping the fields that we need to populate so that we don't have to have multiple input files. For instance, in this case, we will have 2 input files rather than 9 if we were populating the tables individually.
So let's go back to LSMW and look at the next step. That is to maintain source fields within the structures that we've created for the input data. Okay, as you can see, this is the structure for the master data that we created. You can collapse that, expand it again. In case you're wondering where the other structure disappeared to, well, if we go down to the very bottom here, you'll see it's contained within the main structure. We can expand that, and these are the fields that I've added to the structure. Okay, now how do we add fields? There are a number of ways of doing that. You can create fields, create fields individually by adding the name, description, giving it a field length, a field type. But this is a pretty time-consuming way of doing it, especially if you've got a lot of fields. An easier way is to copy from elsewhere. To do that, we can copy from a file that we've created externally, a text file separated with tabs, which will contain the fields with the correct field length, field type. You can copy from another object, if that's another LSMW object. You can copy from the data repository. In this case, we'd be copying from the structure BALTD, which is what I did here. Or you can copy it from a data file where you have the field names in the first line. Personally, I prefer to copy from the data repository because it ensures that you have initially all possible fields for that structure. You don't have to use them all. You do have to populate the fields that are mandatory, but the others you can pick and choose what you want to include. And you can delete fields at a later stage if you want to. To find out what fields are mandatory, you should go to the front end, go to the application, and check out what fields you must populate if you're going to create a record through the front end. And then go back to your source file and make sure you've got those fields populated in it. The other good thing about doing it this way from the repository is that the names that are automatically given to the fields are the same names that are within the SAP structure. And this makes it easier at a later stage for mapping. So that's basically how we create the fields within our structures. So let's go back out to LSMW. Now the next step is to maintain structure relations. And what that means is we map the external structure that we created to the SAP internal structure. As you can see, the internal structure here is called BALTD for the master data, asset accounting, BALTB for the transactional data in asset accounting. And these are the two that we created where I just added str underscore before the names. So when we want to create, these are created already, but when we want to create, we just go to here and we create the relationship. When we click on a structure, click on this button here, it gives you the external structures that are available. You pick the one you want, you go to the next, you do the same thing, you save it. Now you've got your mapping at the top level, at the structure level completed. Back to LSMW. Now, the next step is to maintain field mapping and conversion rules. But before we look at that, we need to look at the next step, which is maintain fixed values, translations, and user-defined routines, because these are accessed in the previous step here. So let's go in here. Okay, now I've just set up a test value for fixed values for translations and for user-defined routines. I don't use these myself because I prefer to get the data in shape before inputting it into SAP. I use SQL Server, where I import legacy data into a SQL Server database and use SQL scripts to manipulate the data, to find duplicates, to find redundant data, to delete those, delete the duplicates, add additional fields, change field lengths, data types, and so on and so forth. I think it's easier to do it like that, but SAP does provide some tools where you can do that within the LSMW structure, but it's a matter of personal choice. So let's look at this here. Okay, if we go to test for fixed values, right, I've just set up a fixed value called test fixed value, and given it the value of 100 and the data type of character with a field length of 3. You can use this where a particular field in your input file is always going to have the same value. But you can also always do that in your input file by just giving it the same value for every line, every record in the file. So this is not really all that necessary. Translations, again, this refers to where you might want to change data type from, say, numeric in a legacy system to text field in SAP. You can do that as part of the LSMW routine. So again, there are various parameters that you set to do this. Again, I prefer to do it outside SAP. I think it's neater, more flexible. And then user-defined routines. Again, you can create some fancy routines if you need to manipulate data. Once again, I don't use this. I'm just showing it because it's an option here in LSMW. So if we go back to then maintain field mapping and conversion rules, this is necessary. Okay, this is our structure. These are our fields. Now, on the left here, we have the SAP structure and the SAP fields. On the right, I've mapped the input structure, str_baltd, and the input fields that we created in an earlier step. As you may remember, because I copied from the data repository, I copied the baltd structure, I copied the fields within that, so the names match up, BUKRS, BUKRS, ANLKL, and so on. Now, how we do this, there's a number of ways of doing it. First of all, we can assign source fields individually, but this is a manual process and it's quite time consuming. But if you want to do it, you select the field here and apply a source field, whichever one you want. Just earlier, we looked at fixed values, translations, and user-defined routines, fixed values here. If we go to own selection and see what's available. Okay, and we see the test fixed value that we created earlier. So we could select that for any particular field if we wanted to. Similarly with translations, we can go in there, select one of the translations we created earlier, and under rule, we can select a user-defined routine, pick the one we selected earlier, or any other one that we've previously created. but I prefer to use this option here, which is the auto field mapping. And here we have some options. You can change various fields. You have various options you set here. And when you apply this, it matches up field names that are the same. So that's the value of creating fields from the data repository, which have the same name as the fields within the SAP structure. So when we run the auto mapping, it's all done for you. You don't have to go through it line by line by line. And that's very important when you have dozens and dozens and dozens of fields, as we have in this particular example here. So that's how we do the field mapping and conversion rules. Back to the LSMW. In this next step, we specify our input files. So we go into specify files here. Now, depending on where we have stored the files, we take either this option or this one here. This one is taken if we have our files on our PC on the front end. If we have the files on the application server, we go to this option here. And we have two structures, so we therefore have to have two files. And all we do is go here and add an entry. We give it a name, like this one here, BALTB file, BALTD file 3. I had 3 different versions earlier. And we pointed at the location for that file on either your PC or your application server. Now, you also have imported data and converted data. You don't have to worry about these. These files are system generated, and this one contains the data when it's first imported, and this one contains the data when it's converted based on whatever translation rules we've specified earlier. You save all that and go back out to LSMW. Okay, in the next step, we now assign those files. So if you remember, we created 2 file names here. We pointed them at the locations. And now we just assign them to the 2 source structures that we created earlier. Okay, so this is the master data and this is the transactional data. So now the system knows the structure of our source data, the fields within that, and where the files are stored. We save that and go back out. Okay, so we've assigned the files. At this stage, we just read the data into the system. Okay, now we have these 2 checkboxes here. This refers to numeric values and assumes the format is going to be as here, and that your date value is going to be year, month, date. I normally leave these checked because I make sure my data is in this format. You have an option of reading in a number of transactions. So if you're testing, for instance, and you have a very large number of records in your input file, you might want to just test with the first 10 or 100, so 1 to 100, 1 to 10, whatever you want. You execute this, and if you've done everything correctly up until now, which is a tricky bit, you'll get a success message at this point. And then go back to LSMW. In this next step, we have an option to display the data that we've just loaded into the system. You don't have to do this, but it's always a good idea to make sure everything looks all right. Okay, now again, if we have large volumes of data, we can select particular lines to look at, but I'm going to leave that blank. Okay, and this is just test data that I loaded, so there are not many transactions. In yellow here, we have the BALTD structure. In blue, we have the transactions within that. And again here, so I've loaded 2 master records, each of which have 2 transactions. And everything looks okay. If you want to look further, you click on that. You can go down through the individual fields. This / represents a blank value. That looks okay. So let's go back out.
We now run this step here, which is convert data. And that applies any rules, user-defined routines, translations that we may have specified earlier. Now, we didn't specify any in this example, but we still have to run this program. So when you run it and you get a success message, you just go back out here. And again, you have the option to display the converted data. A good idea to do this. Let's do it. Again, we can specify individual lines, line ranges. I'll leave that blank. Yeah, and this is similar to what we saw earlier, but this is the converted data. Earlier we were looking at the data that was just loaded into the system. You can click on individual lines and see the various fields, the values that are there. Always a good idea to look at these to make sure that they look right. Particularly in the data that was just loaded, that was the earlier display that we showed, because sometimes we can get errors where field lengths are wrong and some data runs from one field into the next, and it may not be caught by the validation. So it's a good idea to display a number of records to make sure that they all look fine. Okay, that looks good. So let's go back out. Okay, so we've displayed the converted data. Now the next thing we do is convert a batch input system session, I should say. And here we have an option to run it in test mode without updating the database. Always a good idea to do that initially. If we're having problems, we can run it the transaction in the foreground, so we see each step as the data is being loaded, and that's good for debugging problems. This last one here just displays the structures that we've used, but it's not really necessary. So once we've got the test data running okay, everything looks good, we don't have to run it in the foreground. We just uncheck all these boxes, execute it, and that creates a batch. Okay, and then the final step is to run that batch. If we take this option here, we just get transaction SM35, where we process the batch as we would with any other batch. This is not part of LSMW, it's just a link to transaction SM35. So that is it for the steps involved in LSMW.
To recap, in the first step, we maintain the attributes for our object. We decide what data we're going to input. In our case here, it was data for asset accounting. We decide what method we're going to use. In our case, we used batch input. We then specify what input structures we're going to use. We give them names. We then specify what fields are going to be in those structures. We then map those structures to the SAP structures. We then map the fields within our input structure to the fields within the SAP structures. We set up any fixed values, translations, or user-defined routines. We then specify our input files. We give them names, and we specify where they're located. We then assign those files to our source structures. We then read in the data in those files. We can display that data. We then convert that data using any translations or routines that we specified up here. We then have the option to display that data. Everything looks okay. We create a batch input session, and then we run the batch input session. That's our overview of LSMW completed. In our LSMW configuration tutorial, we'll be creating a new project, a new sub-project, and a new object. We'll be creating structures, going through each of these steps in detail, source fields, mapping, specifying the files, reading the data in, and converting it, and loading it into the system with the batch input session. We'll also be going into some detail on how to best create the input files, making sure that we use the correct data types and field lengths, a very important step within LSMW. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and good luck with LSMW.